grace to you and peace from God our Father and from our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. Our founding fathers were very adamant. They fought mightily for the idea that we as a country, once we were established, would not ever be governed by a king. There's some discussion, debate back in the old days that when the founding fathers were trying to determine who was going to be the first leader of our nation, and of course they eyeballed George Washington. A number of them looked at George Washington and said, you know, George Washington, in order for us to treat you in the way that you need to be treated, in order for us to treat the head of state the way that we should, we really need you to be a king. And Washington famously was adamantly opposed to that idea. Kings had caused problems throughout history. And so we as a country would never be subject to any kind of royal ruler. Washington and some of the other founding fathers said, listen, this must be a representative republic. That is to say, we are a government of the people, by and for the people. And so we will not even have as our figurehead, as our leader of our government, somebody that we call a king. We have to call him something else. And so we have gone by president ever since then. The concept of the way in which we govern ourselves, representative republic, of the people, by the people, for the people, is a very foreign concept to much of the world. And even when you look at the natural world, when you look at the way that other human beings have organized government and so forth, this way of electing our leaders every few years, of electing representatives, of having balance of power, is something that the rest of the world doesn't quite understand. And whether we like it or not, we have a tendency to yield to all kinds of kings in the world, even though we're a part of this country. Kinds of kings that rule around the world and their methods of power are numerous. For example, if you look at the natural world, the king cobra gets its name in large part because of its immeasurable natural power. The king cobra is the kind of snake that when it gets up as high as it can almost be eye to eye with the average human being, and one bite from that snake can be mortally wounding to an elephant. Natural power. And therefore, this snake is considered to be the king cobra. We have other kings in our world who have ascended to that place merely because they were born to the right people at the right time and the right point in history. That is to say, birthright. King James I, famous because he is the one that authorized the creation of the King James Bible, was one of those rulers. He simply came to power. Why? Because it was his birthright, because he was born to the right parents at the right time and the right place. And therefore, he was the king. And of course, popularity is the kind of thing that will make a person king, and we will bend a knee to that person too. There is argument in the world over who the king of pop is. Michael Jackson or Elvis Presley. But how many of us have bent a figurative knee to Elvis Presley? Come on, be honest with me. How many of you have tried at some point to say, thank you very much, right? Come on, we've all done it. How many of you have had a peanut butter and banana sandwich because that's what the king did? That's what he enjoyed. Elvis Presley is one of those people who ascended to where he was because of sheer popularity. We are a country whose founding fathers decided that we were not going to be governed by a king, and yet the notion of having a representative republic is a very foreign concept around the world, not just in terms of human beings and how they rule, but also in terms of the natural world. There are kings of the jungle, for example, and they are what? Lions. There are kings of the fast food world, and they're called what? Burger King. Thank you very much for that creative thing. We have kings all over the place, and the rest of the world doesn't recognize what our founding fathers fought long and hard for. And yet, despite what our founding fathers fought long and hard for, we still, as human beings, even in this country, will bend a knee to power, popularity, identity, and we're okay sometimes with being, if you will, subject to those kings around the world, whether they be our favorite fast food place or our favorite pop singer. Into our blue suede shoe-wearing, hamburger-munching world, then, comes a king who is no other than like any other king that has come into the world. And he never fit the mold of what all other kings that have come into the world are like. And in order to get at that, we start by going to the book of John, where we encounter this king, and he is portrayed in John's gospel at this point in the story as being a troublemaker. He is perhaps, as the story is unfolding, maybe even a criminal. But there he stands in front of not the king, but the governor of the area, Pontius Pilate, the Roman-placed governor, the guy who in that part of the world has the most power to wield. And he stands there before him. His hands are bound. He is absolutely worn out from the night that he has suffered, and he is now ragged from an absolute lack of sleep. And as we pick up Luke's gospel that we read from today, this king, supposed as he is, ultimately is put to death on a cross, which is no small thing. Because the cross back in those days was not something that you would put someone to death upon lightly. The cross was reserved as the most gruesome form of capital punishment for the worst type of person that there was. Murderers, armed robbers. These were the kinds of criminals who were put to death on crosses. Not people who claimed to be kings. Not royalty. As you may know from Paul's own life later on. Paul, because he's a Roman citizen, because he is a person of some elevated social station, when he finally is put to death, he is not crucified like a common criminal. He is put to death by the sword, because that is a more dignified way to be put to death. And so as we encounter this king today in John's gospel and in Luke's gospel, what we have is this person who many think is really nothing more than a rabble-rouser, and he's a common crook. He's a person who's going to be put to death in the most gruesome way because he is not at all what he or others claim him to be. The interesting thing is that in the Gospels, Jesus rarely claims the title of king for himself. He does on few small occasions, but rarely does he ascribe the notion of king to himself. That is something that most other people look to him and want to pin that title on him. Famously, as he rides into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, the people are hailing him as the arriving Messiah. Why? Because what they want him to do is they want him to become the new king of God's people. They see Jesus as being the guy who's going to restore David's dynasty to its former glory. King David, of course, Old Testament, God's servant, greatest king that Israel ever had. And what the people see now is with the Romans occupying Jerusalem and God's Holy Land, what they see is that Jesus is there to ascend back to the throne that David had left. And now Jesus is going to become their new king in that way. It's not often that Jesus subscribes the notion of kingship to himself. Most often it's other people wanting to pin that title onto him. Jesus, infrequently though, does claim to be a king. And along with that, what ends up happening? Jesus upsets the power apple cart. You have a guy named King Herod, who happens to be the king of the Holy Land at the time. You've got the Romans under Pontius Pilate. And now you've got this guy Jesus who comes in. And he's gaining a lot of popular support. The people love him. And people like Herod and Pilate don't know what to make of this guy, bless you. And they want to figure out how are they going to deal with him along with the religious authorities. And so what Jesus does is by coming into the world, he threatens to undermine the religious order as well as the secular government. Again, people want him to be the king that David was and get rid of the Romans. That threatens the secular government. Now Jesus also comes, and now the religious authorities say, we got to get rid of this guy. He's a threat to us. And so this is part of the problem. And so here Jesus stands in front of Pilate in John's gospel, and he's handcuffed. He's worn out. He has no seeming power whatsoever. This guy can't hurt a fly at this point. He's absolutely tired from the night that he's preceded. He has no allies, no popularity. And what does Pilate do with that? Pilate cuts to the chase with Jesus. And he puts to Jesus the question that's on everybody's mind. Are you the king of the Jews? It's a simple question. Yes or no? Are you the king of the Jews? And if Jesus says no, it's going to hurt for a little bit. But it's all going to be over in just a little bit too. Are you the king of the Jews? Yes or no, Pilate says. And if Jesus says no, he's not, Jesus will be punished. He'll probably be flogged for creating all this problem. But after that, they're going to let him lead a quiet life. If Jesus says no, he's not king. The religious authorities go back to the way things are supposed to be. The Roman authorities have no threat to their power, and the world is back to the way it's supposed to be. But how does Jesus answer? Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus' response to Pilate is not yes or no. Jesus says to Pilate, is that your own idea? Or did others talk to you about me? Note something important here. Jesus isn't denying what Pilate is levying against him. Are you the king of the Jews? Jesus isn't saying no, he's not. But what Jesus starts to do is, Sean, is instead of saying yes or no to Pilate, what Jesus does is he holds that idea out there lingering. Jesus doesn't do what most kings do. Most kings, in order to get your allegiance, will compel you to believe in them and pay homage to them. They'll do it by persuasion, they'll do it by flattery. Most often they'll do it simply by brute force. Believe in me or else. Earthly kings command allegiance from their subjects, but Jesus doesn't do that with Pilate. Jesus invites allegiance. Are you the king of the Jews? Yes or no? Did you come to that notion by your own, or did somebody tell you about it? See what Jesus is doing. He's not saying, I am the king and you will bow down. That would be compelling Pilate. And what would be the logical outcome of that? It wouldn't be pretty. What Jesus does instead is he invites Pilate into a confession of faith in who he is. This is the same thing that Jesus does when he goes to call his disciples to follow him. Jesus goes to Peter and Andrew. And notice how Jesus does not ever say to Peter and Andrew, follow me or else. Hey guys, by the way, FYI, a new king's in town and I'm it. So drop everything you're doing and follow me or else. What does Jesus do? Jesus says, follow me. He doesn't command allegiance from Peter and Andrew, he invites it. Peter and Andrew there are busy doing their stuff, and Jesus says, follow me. And they are moved beyond any explanation that humans can come up with to drop everything they're doing and the lives they've been leading and to follow this guy for 3 years. And after he's died and been crucified and risen again, do they give up on the cause? No. They spend the rest of their natural born lives to the point of martyrdom, following him as well. It was never coerced. It was never brought about in them by brute force. It was an invitation, and they were moved to say yes to it. Coerced allegiance, kings who tell you to believe or give me allegiance or else, it never works out, folks. You look at human history, and kings that have compelled their subjects to give them allegiance, it never works out well. Adolf Hitler said, hey, I am your Führer. And he goes and he takes over most of Europe during the 30s and the 40s. And what did Hitler say? His reign was going to last for 1,000 years. Hitler said he was going to be in power for 1,000 years. How long did his reign last? 12. And why? Because Hitler compelled allegiance by brute force. You don't want to go along with what I'm about? We'll throw you in jail. We'll throw you in concentration camp. Hitler was notorious for coercing that, and what did that breed? It bred resentment. You look at what happened in France in terms of the resistance. Everywhere where Hitler was in power, that coerced allegiance bred resentment. It didn't breed following. By the way, guys, just this last week, what happened in Zimbabwe? Robert Mugabe's been in power for 30, 40 years. Did he do it by inviting people to believe in him, to bend a knee to him? No. And how did that work out for him? There's a new president in Zimbabwe as we speak. Didn't work out well. Coercion doesn't breed following, it breeds resentment. And it won't be too long until a coup comes along and knocks that king out of power. And so this is the brilliance of what God does through Jesus here. Is rather than coercing people like Pilate, Peter, Andrew, anybody to bend a knee and give him homage, Jesus invites faith. And that's crucial. Second thing that Jesus does in his answer, and that is equally as brilliant, is when Peter responds, or Pilate, I should say, responds back and says, "You're a king then." Now understand here, Pilate is not asking a question. He's stating a fact. And in response to Pilate saying, "You are a king then," three different ways that we can take a look at it from three translations. NRSV says, Jesus responds, "You say that I'm a king." NASB says, "You say correctly that I'm a king." And the NIV says, "You're right in saying that I'm a king." The reason why I use these three translations is that it gives us kind of a full picture of what Pilate and Jesus are talking about here. Pilate goes ahead and throws out an established fact. Pilate is not asking Jesus a question, a follow-up question to say, "So now wait a second, are you a king?" No. He's saying, "You are a king then." He is restating a fact, and here's the thing. Pilate doesn't even know that he's stating what is true. You are a king. And Jesus says to him, "You said it, not me. You declared it, not me. You said that I'm a king, and I am." Regardless of how the world will end up treating Jesus, and in the next 24 hours, 12 hours after this episode happens, the world is going to treat Jesus in the worst way we've ever treated any human being. But the fact remains is that a king has come into the world, and there can be no denying whatsoever that Jesus is the one. Which brings us to Luke's gospel again. And as Jesus is hanging on the cross, it was typical back in those days that when a condemned person was crucified, they would hang a placard above their head describing the charges under which they were capitally punished. And of course, famously, Pilate has written, "Jesus Christ, the King of the Jews." And what do the religious leaders come back to him and say? No, you can't write that, Pilate. What you need to do is you need to erase that, and say instead, "This man said, I am King of the Jews." And what does Pilate famously say? "What I've written, I have written." You're a king. He's not asking a question. And when he is challenged on it later on, Pilate cannot help himself but declare what is already true. This man, no. You got to erase this and say, "This man said I'm King of the Jews." Nope. What I've written, I've written. And the truth of what Jesus is there in black and white. This is the King of the Jews. And so perhaps it's fitting that as we close out this church here, the final words that are said about Jesus during his earthly lifetime are the final words that we wrap up this church here with. And as we look forward ahead to next week and the start of a new church here, we're going to be into Advent and we're going to be celebrating his birth. But for today, we relish one more time God's complete and utter brilliance. that he sent his Son into the world, and he declared him to be who he truly is. And he compelled a man who did not have faith in him to state precisely, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, who he really is. And gives us a word of caution about what the crowds said about Jesus. What did the crowds say about Jesus? When Pilate said, "Here's your king. Do you want me to crucify your king?" What was their response? "We have no king but Caesar." No. We have no king in Caesar. We have no other king, period. Our only true king, despite what natural power, popularity, a human being through brute force will try to compel from us, the only true king that we have is Jesus Christ our Lord. And that is who we celebrate. Amen. At this time, Anna's going to share our water life.